Hey, this is Notser, and today we're going to be talking about the new and improved German dispersion pattern. This is coming in 8.11. This is on the public test server. I think it's round 1 or round 2 testing. And I am in my GK. I'm running the exact same build that I run on live. It's a tank accuracy build. I don't go into secondaries because honestly I'm just so disappointed that they're so over budgeted that an effective secondary build, I basically can't be a tank. So I've decided to be a tank, because I think that's what battleships should do, and because of that, I'm very comfortable with this build. So what Wargaming proposed in devblog is that they would come in and change the dispersion pattern associated with German battleships. Now currently, in 8.10, and prior to that, the dispersion pattern for the Germans is very flat and horizontally spread. So it looks like it's squashed down. It has limited vertical drift, but a hell of a lot of horizontal drift. And what that ends up happening for the Germans is you'll notice that shells in the old pattern would just spread out across the horizon line, and you would be, you would be a prisoner to this pattern. You couldn't do anything about it. And with the Sigma that some of these Germans have and the limited number of guns, it wasn't even in the same ballpark. So a proposed change by Wargaming was to apply the American dispersion pattern, which is much more cylindrical. If you think about it, your crosshair obviously is where your guns are aiming. There is a dispersion pattern basically in the background that has a rough estimate of exactly where the shells could actually randomly land based on RNG and Sigma and all that stuff. And for the Americans, it's just more centered around a center point, not necessarily a weird, odd object. Think of this as comparing the Tiny Tim to the Havar rockets for the Americans. The Havar rockets are very horizontally spread out, but it's got a very shallow vertical, and that has some strengths and weaknesses, obviously, going a perfect broadside target. But when you're engaging a target with any bit of angling, the Havar rockets end up being a little bit more weak when you compare them to the Tiny Tims, because from the approach, it might mean that you will have a easier time or harder time, but with the Havar rockets, you have one way of doing massive damage, and if the target isn't precisely this way, in the case of the German battleships, perfectly broadside, it ends up being more of a penalty than a benefit. So they're just trying to make the dispersionary pattern more universal in its use case, depending on the target's angling, all that stuff. And I'm totally for that. I love the American dispersionary pattern, and I love their super heavy, and I love the shell arc. Obviously, we're not getting the super heavy AP or the shell arc, but what we do end up getting is that the aim point itself is a little bit closer all the way around to where you actually aim, and it doesn't get an extreme weird squashiness that ends up being the pattern on the worst extremes. So, overall, the GK itself, wherever you aim, the shells stay closer to that with a little bit more vertical drift, which is okay. I mean, it's very subtle vertical drift. But the overall accuracy, the amount of area where your shell could disperse is 2% better. So it's just a slightly smaller circle versus a much wider and fatter oval. That's the difference between them two. And you know what? I've had huge success with both patterns. I've played a ton of the Montana, a ton of the GK. This feels really fine. I think it works well. I think overall this will end up feeling like, you know what, at least it's in the ballpark. It's much closer, and for active combat, it's more traditional circle. It's easier to envision an aim point, just as it's easier to use the Tiny Tims from any direction versus the Havar from in less ideal, right? The same rules apply. The dispersion pattern shrinks up to a point where you better aim perfectly for the shell to intersect with the target, otherwise it will miss long and short, more extreme. So, overall, I feel like this is a good change. It has to be a good change. You are gaining accuracy, 2% to be precise. Now, it's much more complex than just that because the pattern itself is different. But I think that for active combat, it's far easier to use a Montana against an actively maneuvering target than it is to use a GK because of that weird horizontal drift that all the GKs and all the Germans have to deal with. Now, that's not the only thing that they've sort of opened up for the Germans. They've also taken away any requirement that the hydroacoustic duration extension module be limited to only DDs and cruisers. You can actually equip it to German battleships now. Is that a play that players will end up doing? I don't know. It does compete with lower fire and flood chance. And let's be real, the German battleships, they're big. They take a lot of attention. It's just the nature of it. So I don't really know if I would validate that as a buff to the German battleships because it's really a compromise on your tank ability. And let's be real. Can you afford to compromise on your tank ability with Smolensk burning you down from any range with the millions of fires that are set constantly? What I know for a fact is the dispersionary pattern is more usable in active combat. It is a more recognizable dispersionary pattern for those of us who enjoy our Americans or our British. And I think that's good. I don't disagree with it at all. Honestly, I think I know what Wargaming was attempting to do back in the day. They were trying to give the lines each their own shot pattern. And I could get that. I could get behind that. But ultimately, what really ends up being the most valued aspect of these ships is just the overall package. And yeah, you could say, oh, well, you know, the GK and the Montana, they have 12 guns. So does the Conqueror. We need all three of them to have 3 different dispersion. One of them is just going to miss out. And it was clearly the Germans who missed out on that dispersionary pattern. So at least that was rectified. Now we have differences and one ship having more armor, AA, the ability to recover health. But we don't really have to consider the super difference dispersion that the Germans ended up having to use. The effect on this in game, does this mean that the GK is now the top dog? Of course not. It does not mean that the ship is now relevant for everyone to love and, dominate with. That's not there. But what it does mean is that you get a little bit more consistency. With a little bit more consistency, you should be able to reliably place yourself in a position to mitigate damage and assist your teammates. And you're not going to let yourself or your teammates down as frequently with the improved dispersion. And as far as I'm concerned, I want this yesterday. The German consistency has always been frustrating. It always has been frustrating. And I think trying to normalize the dispersion so that it is at least in the same ballpark as more successful designs, I think that's the right approach. There's a lot of things wrong with the American battleships. Their speed as you level up, maybe the ability for their armor to stop incoming, but their guns and their dispersionary pattern is not one of them. Their guns are outstanding. I think that the Montana has the highest damage per minute of any battleship in the game. And you definitely notice it playing it. So transferring anything that would be an improvement over from the Montana and the Iowa and the North Carolina over to the Germans is a plus. And I'm excited to see if this means that with more consistency, the Germans will be more interested in putting themselves out there, because they're the brawling tanks. They're on the other side of the Soviet coin, and the Kremlin has been very relevant, albeit artificially, because the Sigma is really high and its consistent accuracy is kind of ridiculous. But we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is the German dispersion getting a buff, and that's good. Now, can we get some secondary buffs or make them a cheaper build? It's a really frustrating aspect of this. We're getting a buff and it's helpful, and we're getting a certain duration buff, but secondaries aren't really seeing any love. And I don't know when or if they will. I think that secondary adjustments are sort of on the back burner because of the subs, because of CV rework. Everything was moved back, and, you know, it's just the case that if you want to play the game with secondaries, you have to make sacrifices. Significant sacrifices to your tank ability or your playability. They didn't make any changes from the gun angles. I think people highlighted that gun number 3 and number 4 on the GK. They're kind of wide open. You know, if they would just make the gun angle slightly better, the ship itself would be even more powerful. And honestly, I think if they would make that gun angle change, I think it would make the GK too powerful. It would be like in this position right now, I could literally fire all my guns rather than having to angle so extreme. Because of that, you know, I might be able to mitigate even more damage. So it's a very, very careful rope that they're going through. I'd estimate that, you know, ultimately this buff is less than 5% to the effectiveness of the Germans, but it's probably a way higher consistency buff that everyone can get behind. And honestly, that's the thing that I cared more about anything else. I love the guns. I love everything about the GK. I just hated the consistency of the Germans. The mid-tier Germans, it's a real pain with the limited amount of guns. And I kind of feel like the Gneise now, it's still going to be a pain, but it's going to be less extreme pain. And I think that's good. So, you know, overall, positive feeling on this German Dispersion. It's not going to revolutionize the line. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. It's a very subtle tweak on a line that, in my opinion, just needed subtle tweaks. Maybe here, maybe secondaries. It would be godlike in whatever it wanted to do on a brawling front. Game itself worked pretty good. And honestly, shells look pretty good too. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to check out more of my content, you can click the most recent or the most relevant uploads. You could also choose to subscribe to my channel. We do daily World of Warship videos, first impression, how-to, news, and review related. My North American recruit invite is on the screen. You can take advantage of that. I stream at twitch.tv/notser. Thank you, have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you next time.